Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. My name's Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG, and I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CG Signature Lecture Series. Thanks also to all of you for joining us at this event, whether you're here as part of our live audience or joining us through our webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences at the microphones here at CG at the stairs, or through the live chat function on your screen if you're watching from home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Anytime a population grows, change erupts, whether in the context of a growing family, a thriving business, or, as we'll see in tonight's lecture, a growing world. Population growth requires new rules, norms, leadership, and governance. Here to discuss the new governance required for a world of 10 billion people is Professor Jack Goldstone. Jack comes to us tonight from Washington, D.C., where he's John T. Hazel Professor of Public Policy and Senior Fellow at the Mercatus Center of George Mason University. He's also the Director of the Center for Global Policy at that university and serves as a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. Jack's research is focused on economic growth in the global economy and effects of population growth. He recently published the edited volume, Political Demography, How Population Changes Are Reshaping International Security and National Politics. He's now working on 2 volumes addressing politics. And I can also highly recommend his 2013 book, Revolutions, a very short introduction. So please join me now in welcoming tonight's distinguished guest, Professor Jack Goldstone.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Waterloo and at CG. Tonight I'm going to talk about what we need to have a well-run world of 10 billion people. 10 billion people is what we expect to have actually very soon, by the middle of this century, if not sooner. Now, a lot of people will tell you that's just too many people. But I don't think that's the real issue. We have a little over 7 billion people in the world now. I think we can manage an additional 3 billion without too much trouble. The real problem comes in understanding where those people are, how old they will be, and how we redistribute resources around the world. Now let me give you the good news first. And the good news is that global population growth is actually slowing down quite a bit. Now, this growth curve is what scares a lot of people. You see population growing. 1950, less than 3 billion, jumps to 6 billion by the turn of the millennium, and we're now about 7 billion, well on our way to 10 billion. But shortly after that, growth should cease. It may trickle on a little bit. We may get to 10.5 billion. Some people are worried about 11 or more. But this very rapid growth that we've gone through is coming to an end. And you can see that more clearly on this lower curve. This is the growth rate, which was about 2% a year all the way from 1950 to 1990. But then something happened. Growth rates dropped. Now global growth rate is down to about 1% a year. It'll be down to about 0.5% a year by 2040 and will gradually disappear. Now, the reason for that is straightforward. People all over the world, in rich countries, poor countries, big countries, small countries, the more women get educated, the more income people have, the more they choose to invest more of their resources in fewer but better educated and better nourished children. So for surprisingly, almost all the countries in the world, whether you're talking about India, China, Indonesia, as well as Europe and America, Russia, in all of these countries, the number of children that women are having has dropped pretty close to or even below 2 children per family. Even countries like Brazil are down below 2 children per family, so below replacement. So although some countries in the world are growing fast, which I will mention as we go on, the majority of countries in the world are seeing a steady decline in population growth, And so the rate of expansion that our children will have to live with is going to be much less than the kind of very dramatic growth that has occurred in the last 50 years. Moreover, world food production has done very well. Bigger problem in much of the developing world today is obesity rather than malnutrition. It is true that there's still far too many people living in poverty and suffering food insecurity. Probably around 1 billion people today still are hungry and malnourished, some of them right here in North America, particularly in the United States and Mexico. But that's the exception now. The great majority of people have enough food to eat. The big demands on our food system in the future will be the demand for richer diets, more meat, more steaks, more poultry, more bacon. Producing meat is a labor and especially water and energy intensive process. And that is where we may run into some issues in the future. But right now, there's still a lot of arable land in the world that is not irrigated, that could be more productive than it is today. And we're seeing improvements in fertility of the soil where it's well cared for. We're seeing advances in hydroponics. So I can tell you, population growth is slowing down, food production is up. As long as we don't suffer a catastrophic change in climate, which is a very real risk, as I'll allude to later, but as long as our climate holds up reasonably well, we should be able to feed ourselves well into the future. We may not get the same selection of seafood in the future, and meat may be more expensive, but the population of the world is not going to starve. So what's it going to be like to live in this world of slower growth? Well, it's not all good. For most of the end of the last century, growth averaged 4% a year in population. And although you could say, well, isn't that a tremendous drain and a strain on resources, it was also a very powerful motor for economic growth. And the innovations to meet those demands in housing, in clothing, in food, in entertainment, in travel, improve the quality of life for everyone. Now, that growth is going away. Growth is very unlikely to exceed 3%, and indeed often 2.5%. And in some countries, growth is already turning negative. Japan and Germany already are seeing population decline. Now, Africa is a case where you can say, but isn't population growth still going to be overwhelming in Africa? And the answer is yes, and we have to worry about that. But again, to take a look at the global picture, even very rapid growth of the economies in Africa, I mean, assume that they continue to have 2 to 3% population growth a year, assume that their economies start catching up with the West. Let's say they get GDP growth of 7% a year. That's great for Africa. However, globally, we're seeing a slowdown in China, a slowdown in Brazil, a slowdown in Russia. The economy of Europe is stuck in the doldrums. The economy of America is being hailed as the motor of the world when it's only growing at 2.5% a year. So we're looking at a world of generally much slower economic growth. Probably at best, global economic growth rates will be half in the next half century what they were in the preceding half century. And we'll just have to adjust to that somehow. There's no way that we can somehow light a fire. We can talk about great technological changes. Will there be self-driving cars? Probably. Will we be able to print various widgets and circuit boards? Yes. But all of those things do not replace the demand for goods and services that comes from a young, growing population. So we're going to have a world of slower growth overall, population growth around the world leveling off. However, that doesn't mean that everything is going to grow at that same slow pace. There are at least 5 population groups that are going to grow very fast, quite a bit faster than the world population. Now, I've referred to this kind of subgroup explosion as the new population bomb. The old population bomb was something Paul Ehrlich wrote about in the 1960s. He worried that world population was going to flood poor countries, that they would suffer from starvation, mass disease. None of that has happened. But I think part of the reason we avoided that is that Ehrlich raised his standard and called attention to the fact that population growth was running at 2 to 3% a year worldwide. And in response to that, we got busy. We got busy making family planning more widely available and affordable, and making a green revolution to make feeding a growing population easier and cheaper. And the combination of a revolution in agriculture and the spread of family planning meant we averted the severe problems. That's good news. I mean, a lot of people have said, well, it just shows that there was no real population threat. I don't think that's the case. I think we learned about the threat we faced and we dealt with it. And now, today, we're facing new threats from different kind of population growth. It's the growth of certain subgroups. The aging population, people like me, a lot of us out there, we are all surprisingly healthy, increasingly long-lived, and numerous. The African population, it's a good thing. The African population, as I mentioned, is growing very fast. The African economy is growing very fast. Something that people have only recently woken up to is the very rapid growth of a global middle class. People with incomes in the range of $5,000 US per year, able to afford modern appliances, inexpensive automobiles, travel, local, increasingly international travel. That global middle class is growing much faster than the population as a whole, as poorer countries move up the income ladder. The urban population is also very fast growing. More and more people are moving to cities, even in South Asia, Africa, and China. They are moving toward West European and American levels of urbanization. That is, they're moving to a situation where 3/4 or more of the population live clustered in cities. Now, this is new for mankind as a whole. Humanity has always been predominantly rural, all the way from 50,000 years ago up to about 15 years ago. And it was only in the first decade of this century that the percentage of human beings living in metropolitan areas and large cities has gone over 50% of the total population. And it's going to continue to grow. So we're moving into a world where the urban human being will be typical, and that's never been the case before. And finally, and here's where we really get to the issues of global governance and international security, the population of what we call fragile states, places like Yemen, Somalia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pakistan, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan, these countries are growing at a quite surprising rate. You might think, gee, those places, they're beset by conflict, they're running short on resources, why would population be growing there? Well, it turns out a slowdown in population growth is a feature of prosperity. When people feel they have the security and the autonomy to get by with a smaller family, and they have the means to exercise family planning, that's when fertility goes down. When people feel that the social fabric is being rent asunder and they're under threat and family is the best security they have, birth rates stay high. So each of these groups poses its own dimension for the world of 10 billion population that we'll live in. Now here's a graph. It looks very different from the first one I showed you. This is the population, and this unfortunately got mixed up in the printing. Forgive me. The blue is the global population in the more developed nations. That's a smaller group. It's still growing fairly rapidly. Here we are in 2010. It's going to roughly double in the next 30 years. But this huge takeoff in elderly population is occurring in the developing world. It's countries like China, China, India, Brazil, that are going to have tens and even hundreds of millions of people over age 60 before this century is out. I mean, that makes sense. India and China have over 2 billion people now. Their lifespans are growing, just like ours have been, and their birth rates are dropping. So they're following the path of Western countries and will be aging as well. So I tell people, there's a booming economic market out there in goods and services for people over age 60. It's not just people in Europe and the US, it's a global market. And so whoever becomes the world leader in providing the goods and services that are attractive to people over age 60, which now includes me, that's going to be a big economic benefit in the future. I actually done some work looking at things. For example, you take Nigeria. Nigeria is everybody's favorite rapidly developing country. Despite Boko Haram and the mess in the northeast, Lagos is booming, Nigeria's economy is booming, and people say that that's a great emerging market. And that's true. But it turns out that even if the Nigerian market were to double every 25 years, it's still a relatively small base. A much bigger market is the purchasing power of Europeans 60 and over. In fact, that group is probably going to gain more in purchasing power than the entire population of Nigeria over the next 30 years. Now, the group that is going to be more of an issue for public services and health management is not the population over 60. Fortunately, 60 is like the new 40. That is, the generation reaching 60 now is healthier, more active, more likely to be employed. But the population that is really increasing is the group we sometimes call the very old, and that is those over 80. Now, 30-odd years ago, 1 out of every 50 people in the rich world was over 80. Now, 1 out of 50, that's not very many. That would mean, in a room like this, 2 or 3 people. But as of 2000, it had gone to 1 in 33. That starts to build up. And in 5 more years, it will be 1 in 20. So now we're going from 2 or 3 to 5 or 6 in a room like this. In 2050, it'll be 1 in 10. 2100 is a long way off, so we're hitting kind of a very high level. 10% of the entire population will be over age 80. And that creates a whole different set of relationships. It means a lot of people who are age 50 or 60 will have older parents to take care of. There will be, in some areas, more people kind of over age 80 than under age 10. We're going to see a kind of tilting of the marketplace, of voting, of residences to people who are over age 80. And even though we're living longer and healthier, unfortunately, the wear and tear on the old human body has not stopped. So although people are living longer and not succumbing to terrible threats like cancer at anywhere near the rate they did, we're still wearing out our knees and hips. Our corneas still need to be transplanted when they get cloudy. We need hearing aids. We need blood pressure medication. And so the costs of chronic medical care for the over 80 are growing. And that's not to mention the really frightening issue, and that is Alzheimer's. At the moment, there is no cure for Alzheimer's, and it afflicts approximately 1 out of every 4 people over age 80. The estimates are that by mid-century, if we don't make progress on this, the costs of caring for the Alzheimer-afflicted population alone could be $1 trillion a year. So there is a major issue there. Now, that's the United States, which could afford it, but all around the world, the population over 60 and 80 will be growing. We have to think about access, stairs. I think self-driving cars are arriving just in time, because you wouldn't necessarily want to be on the road where 1 out of 10 drivers is over 80 or 2 out of 10 are over 60. Now, Europe is on the same track, roughly, as the developed world as a whole. But in Japan, they'll already be at 1 in 11 people over age 80 by 2020. So the future is hitting hard there. And it'll be 1 in 6 by 2050. So Japan is very rapidly becoming a nation of the elderly, and it comes at a very bad time for Japan in that they already have a debt of 200% of GDP. So how are they going to make up for the movement of a large number of people into that high care demanding 80+ group? In China, as I mentioned, China too is getting old. In 2000, only 1 out of 100 in China was over age 80, but it's already now closing in on 1 out of 50. And by 2050, they will pretty much have caught up with the developed world, and 1 out of 15 people in China will be over age 80, 1 in 10 by 2080. So even though global population is slowing down, the population in the senior group is going to become a very strong and dominant part of the future. Now, unfortunately, I wish I could tell you otherwise, but the research that we've got so far shows there are a number of ways in which aging populations do hurt growth. Countries get a big bonus out of educating young people and sending them into the workforce to gain experience. The productivity of workers generally continues to grow with their experience from age 20 to 40. So as young people acquire knowledge on the job training, they move up and get more productive. Once a worker reaches age 40, on average, not everyone of course, but on average, productivity tends to peak. And from age 40 to 65, a good outcome is if productivity remains steady. In many occupations, it starts to decline, and after 65, people in demanding occupations have generally left the workforce, and there's no more productivity gain. So if you have a 20-year-old today, you can count on that person for 20 more years of productivity growth, and then 20 more years of stable productivity at high levels. If you have a 40-year-old today, you're looking at probably no productivity growth for the next 20 years, and then their withdrawal from the labor force. And we're moving to a situation where at any point in time, countries will have far fewer 20-year-olds entering the labor force, and will be relying more and more on existing 40-year-olds to stay working. Now, that's fine for keeping people occupied and active and paying taxes, but there's no way that shows the same productivity growth as a younger workforce. You also, of course, get lower workforce participation. As a population ages and people move into their 60s and 70s and 80s, they take retirement and they start to draw down their savings rather than accumulate it. So they start depleting capital. One of the things I point out to people, it's a sad but true fact, when society invests in young people, building schools, providing education, feeding and clothing, and entertaining young people, that's an investment for the future. You see those workers enter the labor force and give you back growing productivity and work for 40 years. Unfortunately, when we invest in hip replacement or knee replacement for seniors, when we invest in feeding, clothing, and entertaining people in their 60s and 70s, we don't get anything back. Those people have generally retired, stopped producing. They may be consulting or working part-time, but you're not looking at a 40-year return on investment. And very sadly, when people pass away, those investments become, they're sunken capital. They get buried with people, unfortunately. You can't reuse a knee joint or a hip joint. And so the good news is, hey, we've got great technology to increase the active lifespan and the work capability and the quality of life for people who are older. But it is expensive, and it's a pure consumption good for most of us, not an investment for the future. Now, how do you make up for that? Well, one way is to keep people working longer. If you give a 65-year-old a hip replacement and they continue to work for another 10 to 15 years, then you are getting a lot of that investment back. And can we do that? Well, we don't know. Companies for the last 50 or 60 years saw it as to their advantage to move people out of the workforce as they got older. Give people a gold watch. Make them happy to retire. Let's picture retirement as a wonderful golden age. The sooner you get there, the better. The longer you'll enjoy it. Why? Because for companies, You hire a bright new 20 or 25-year-old fresh out of school, they come at a lower cost and with more up-to-date knowledge, and they can be counted on to acquire more skill and learning for the next 20 years. There's no point hanging on to a 60-year-old worker if you can replace them with a 20-year-old. But those days are changing. The number of 20-year-olds coming onto the market is sinking very fast. Nowhere so more than China. As a result of China's one-child policy, the number of people in the working age labor force in China started declining in 2010. And it's going to continue to drop to the point where the number of 20-year-olds entering the labor force in China will be declining, so much so that China will have a labor force, surprisingly, almost 500 million people smaller by the end of this century. That is, China's population is going to stabilize. They are at 1.3 billion roughly now. They'll probably be between 1.3 and 1.4 by mid-century, and then they'll start to decline. But the number of people in prime working years will drop enormously, probably from what is close to 900 million now to somewhere around half of that by the end of the century. So this is tough. Companies are going to have to learn, how can we keep older workers happy, productive, and on the job? We just won't be able to replace them fast enough if that's what we need to do. So we'll probably have to change retirement as we know it. Instead of making it a wonderful, golden experience to be enjoyed the longer the better, we have to tell people, look, odds are that a healthy person age 65 now is going to live till 95 or 100. It makes no sense for people to work 45 years from, say, 20 to 65 and then retire for 35 years. You really can't save, unless you're doing really, really well, it's hard to save enough money in a 45-year work span to support yourself at the height of your height of your working income for the next 35 years, especially if prices are rising. It just doesn't add up anymore. And so people will have to be expected to look at retirement the way we used to look at it, as a time when you're unfortunately no longer able to work. And that's a shame and something you want to avoid. Now, it's not that hard to keep people working, fortunately, because more and more jobs don't require great physical exertion. More and more of the heavy labor is being done by robots and machines. What we need people to provide are personal services, creative and artistic services, even management and mentoring to the young, providing indeed all kinds of support services for both the aging and the young who could benefit from it. So there are many useful roles for people to continue to play. And there's no need to say, well, here's what retirement is. You work full-time 40 hours a week until the day you retire, and then it suddenly drops to 0. That doesn't make any sense. Everybody is different. Nobody loses their working capacity all at once. So people should be able to phase in their retirement. You should be able to go on half-time or quarter-time and keep working for a much longer period. But it means thinking of retirement not as getting through the golden gates to unrestricted leisure. It means gradually phasing out of full-time work and entering a new stage with a richer mix of work and leisure activities. So extending retirement will work. Another thing that we need to think about, particularly in the United States where I come from, is we need to make it possible for people who need medical services to shop around the world and get them as cheaply as possible. In America, you're locked into Medicare in the United States. If you need a heart operation or you need a hip replacement, your Medicare only covers you at an American medical facility. Now, it's very strange if we told people in America, you can buy orange juice, but it's got to all come from Florida oranges, local content only, no Brazilian orange juice. Well, the cost of orange juice concentrate would double or triple, because Florida doesn't grow that many juice oranges anymore. They concentrate on table fruit, and we get concentrated orange juice from mass producers like Brazil. So we buy our orange juice, our steel, our cars, wherever the market provides it the best. And it turns out you can get very high quality, low cost medical care now in places like Thailand, India. People say, but isn't it dangerous? Isn't the quality of medical care dangerous and worse? And the answer is no. Surprisingly, the one truth we've found in medicine is that the more procedures a hospital does, the better they get at them. The lower the rate of errors and infections and complications. And so if you have a hospital, doesn't matter whether it's in India, Thailand, or America, or Mexico, if you have a hospital that performs 100 operations a week, they generally have a much higher rate of success and a lower rate of problems than a hospital that does that operation only 5 or 10 times a week. And because they're doing 100 a week, they have it systematized and are able to do it much more cheaply. In America, though, we often just go to our nearest hospital, whether they are specialized providers or not. There are not enough specialized providers for everyone here, but in countries with very large populations and an emphasis on high-quality, low-cost medical care, you can do much better. And so we have actually a thriving industry already in what's sometimes called medical tourism. It's so much a better deal that many American companies who pay for their own health insurance will send employees to Mexico or Thailand or Singapore to have an operation because it's much cheaper for the company, even with the airfare, even with a week at the beach to recuperate. It's still a better deal. But we deny that to much of our own elder population. I've estimated that by encouraging overseas retirement and making medical care benefits portable, Americans could save perhaps $500 million a year in benefits for the 60-plus population. And that's just money sitting on the table that we're losing by requiring and encouraging Americans to consume medical care and retirement in America. There's no reason that people, especially with electronic communication and cheap air flights, people can move and are moving. Costa Rica, Panama City are becoming what Arizona and Florida were to an earlier generation of retirees. Now, we expect by 2040 there could be 80 million US retirees, and if half of those can save $25,000 a year on housing and medical and elderly care, house care, by moving abroad, that would save American taxpayers who are paying much of that support $1 trillion a year. All we have to do is tweak the laws a bit, and we can make things much more manageable. So there are solutions to the issue of care for the elderly if only we're willing to embrace them. And as you'll hear me say, globalization is not the problem. Globalization is the answer. If, for example, America was willing to certify hospitals in Mexico and Costa Rica to provide medical care under Medicare, we would save a lot. But it requires global cooperation and global governance in the public health and medical field. Now, I have some information with you to share with you about Africa. Okay, here's the population curve for China. Boy, that's impressive, up to 2010. I'm sorry, this is not total population. This is the working age population. So we're focused here on people between 15 and 59 years of age. So here's China. Boy, they dominate the growth of the global labor force. No surprise that made in China has become the most common label you see in stores. Now here's India. India was kind of a slow grower, but now from 2010 to 2040, they're going to pass China in number of workers. And increasingly, we'll see manufactured goods come out of India. Europe peaked. Population now is slowing. Latin America still growing, but much slower and smaller than Asia. Here's the United States. The United States continues to grow. Unlike Europe, we still have positive fertility, positive growth, but it's a very slow. You can even see from 1950 to 2010, the growth rate of the US labor force was about twice as fast as it will be in the years after 2010. But, boy, look at that. That's sub-Saharan Africa. That's blowing everybody else away. By 2050, sub-Saharan Africa will have more working age people than China or India, And here's the real amazing thing. On current trends, which I have to say, once you project past 2050, we're speculating. I can't say this is a forecast, but on current trends, by 2070, so that's closer to us now than 1950, which we often don't think of as that far away, but so the future is coming. At this point, sub-Saharan Africa could have more workers than China and Europe combined. So Africa is going to play a very big role in our future. Question is, will those workers be educated and productive? Another way to look at this is to say that more and more of the world's children will be growing up in Africa. In fact, today, about a quarter of all of the children in the world under age 15 are growing up in Africa. That's a large number. But by mid-century, it'll be about 40%. 4 out of every 10 children in the world will be growing up in Africa. Now, okay, here we go. Will Africa be able to educate those children? Will they be able to take care of it? Again, I'm willing to admit good news as well as bad. I'm not a pessimist, actually. The good news is that Africa has been very successful in providing primary level education. So much so that primary education is not only reaching all of the children of primary school age, but even many adults who did not get a primary education when they were school age are going back and learning how to read and write. So you have countries like Madagascar, Angola, where the percentage of people enrolled in primary education is more than 100% of the school-age population, because you have people who are 15, 18, and 20 getting primary education, as well as those aged 6 to 12. And that is wonderful and great success. However, the same effort has not been put into giving secondary education. So almost everywhere else in the world, the number of people who go from primary school to secondary school is constant. If 80, 90% of the children get primary school education, 80 to 90% get at least some secondary school. They may drop out of high school. That is a real tragedy. But they at least start and get some secondary school. But in Africa, there's a huge gap between the provision of primary education and the provision of secondary education. And these numbers, in a sense, they slightly exaggerate the outcome for women. So in many of these countries, you might have 70% of boys going to secondary school, but only 20% of women. What does that mean? Well, if women leave school after age 12, what happens to them? They may get married at age 15 or 16, start having children at 17, 18. They're unlikely to get a job if they get married and have children at that age. And so you have a large number of women getting married young, having lots of children, working part-time or in the informal sector, and it is a real drag on Africa's development. And it is the main reason that in Africa, fertility rates have remained extremely high. Everywhere else in the world, women are having 2 to 3 children, often less than 2. But in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, it's still very common for women to have 5 children per family. In Niger, the average is 7 children per woman. In northern Nigeria, it's about 4, southern Nigeria, a little over 3. In other parts of the continent, it's still between 4 and 5. At those rates of childbearing, Africa's population continues to grow, and that's why we expect that by mid-century, 40% of the world's children will be in Africa. Now, what does that mean for the world as a whole? A couple of things. In 2008, Africa emitted very little carbon per capita, third of a ton. And even that was only because Libya and South Africa were heavy fossil fuel consumers. Compare that to China. China, a couple of years ago, was emitting 7.2 tons of carbon per capita as carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. That's a 20-fold difference. I mean, that's huge. Now, if Africa were to increase its per capita output of carbon, and remember, China is at still a moderate level of development, right? So if we want to bring Africa up to China's level, and they do so by burning fossil fuels the way China does, the carbon emissions from Africa would be as much as Europe, China, and the US combined today. You're talking about increasing emissions per person by a factor of 20, and then you're talking about the number of people by 2060 in Africa growing by a factor of about 2.5. And so even if we make great progress in reducing carbon emissions in Europe, in the United States and Canada, in China, all of that progress could be lost if Africa is put on a high fossil fuel burning development pathway. So Africa needs low fossil fuel growth. That means we need innovations in hydropower, solar, and nuclear that are affordable for developing economies. Education, particularly of women, is vital. I sometimes tell people the most important investment the world can make today is not in better cell phones, it's not in more powerful computers, it's in providing a secondary school education to every woman under age 40 in Africa. If we can do that, we will kind of assure the future in two ways. One, the population growth rate in Africa will be sharply reduced because as women get more educated, they marry later, they want to have more control over their lives, they want to work, and therefore they choose voluntarily to have far fewer children. We also will be positioning the mothers of Africa's children to be more effective mothers with a better education, better able to read to their kids, better able to nourish their kids, and that's the best insurance that the next generation of workers that all of us will depend on is going to be a highly productive workforce. Now, both of those, providing education and providing a new energy regime, require investment, and investment requires good governance and stability. And as you know, Africa has suffered from deficits in that regard. So anything we can do to also help support more stable governments, more effective governments in Africa will help. We do need to renew attention to family planning, not as something that we push or force on people. That's disastrous and a violation of their basic rights. But as women become more educated and choose to have smaller families, we need to make sure that family planning is available just as it is to women who take it for granted as their right everywhere in the developed world. Now you might say, well, why do we need to worry about that? And the answer is that the United States, which is a leader in this area, has had a very back and forth policy. That is, under Democratic presidents, the United States has contributed to family planning programs in Africa. Under Republican presidents, the United States has tended to withdraw its funding from family planning programs. And indeed, when the United States withdraws funding, other countries feel, why should we bother? And so the funding kind of has just seesawed back and forth in a way that's oddly inconsistent. But it's not very expensive to make good family planning available. And countries that have done so, Indonesia, Iran, Muslim countries who undertook government-approved programs to support family planning, saw the education of women rise and fertility levels drop very sharply. There's nothing in the Quran that says women cannot take advantage of family planning. And so it's entirely possible anywhere in the world, but you need the education and you need the availability. Now, Nigeria is on course to have over 400 million people by mid-century. Now, that is a huge number of people. Most of them will be young. Already Nigeria is one of the younger countries in the world. And unfortunately, the result of having huge youth cohorts is that if they don't have employment opportunities, if they don't have faith in the future, if they don't believe their government is heading in the right direction, they often can be drawn into radical groups. Now, this graph is really quite striking. Let me guide you through it. What these bars show, this is the number of countries with outbreaks of new civil conflict. These are religious or civil wars. Countries with a very young age structure just have lots more of these outbreaks of civil violence. It's a very strong relationship. Once countries become youthful, this average drops. Now, these gray bars represent the 1990s. That is, after the collapse of communism, you did have a lot more civil conflict around the world because of global uncertainty. But the relationship returned to stability after 2000. So you're looking at very young populations versus all other, youthful, transitional, mature. There's really a strong threshold here. Once you have a majority of the population over age 25, that is, once the median age hits 25 or more, you start to get a decline in violence and a much higher level of stability. It turns out, if you look at all of the countries that went through the upheaval in the Arab Spring, there's only one country that had a median age above 25, and that was Tunisia. And Tunisia is the one country in the lot where so far violence has been contained and the transition has been, we hope, relatively stable and hope will continue to be. But countries like Yemen and Iraq were some of the youngest countries in the world. And so the odds, unfortunately, were in favor of civil violence, and that's exactly what we've seen. There's also a good story to be told about aging and democracy, and that is, just as very young countries tend to have more violence and civil wars, countries that have higher median age, older populations, tend to be much more successful in achieving and keeping democracy. Here you see how sharp the curve is for once you get out of the young and youthful, but into the transitional, median age here about 28, mature, median age 30 or higher, very good odds that countries will be able to sustain democracy. Why? Completing the demographic transition is necessary for countries to start to have an older population, fertility decline. But the things that go into fertility decline, higher education, fewer children, better investment in children, better long-term economic growth prospects, all of that also seems to pay off in better chances of achieving a democratic outcome. Now, one last concern I had, I mentioned that the population of fragile states was one of those booming, growing subpopulations. We live in a world that has kind of bifurcated. That is, much of the world has become a mature population and has achieved fairly stable governance. But other parts of the world, and no surprise, much of Africa, Middle East, South Asia, these areas are violent. Those black squares represent the outbreak of serious warfare. And you can just eyeball this. For the most part, the violence is concentrated in countries that have what we have called extreme, high, or serious fragility. Now, the violence itself is not the index of fragility. Fragility we measure by the ability of a government to provide education and healthcare services for its population, the number of human rights violations recorded by a government, the rate of economic growth, and the participation in political institutions. Sometimes democracy, but not necessarily democracy. You can have party states that have a high degree of political participation as well. But governments that include most of their population, provide that population with good services and economic opportunities, we consider to be resilient, non-fragile. And so, that's countries, not only the US, but now most of Latin America has achieved moderate to low fragility. China, Russia, even Eastern Europe, they're now at low fragility. Governments are working reasonably well. Now, this was coded, of course, before the collapse of the ruble and the conflict in Ukraine. So Russia is starting to fall out of that. But for the most part, this big stretch of the world here is enjoying reasonably good government. The problems are concentrated here. Now, That has not been a severe problem for the rest of the world, because here we are in 2010. This is the population in the labor force. You remember that's age 15 to 59. So the population of labor force in fragile states has been, relatively modest. I mean, yeah, over 1 billion people, but compared to the population of stable states, there's a big gap. Fortunately, most of the world's workforce is in countries that are politically stable, reasonably well run. People can go to work, be productive, and contribute to the global economy. But look at what's happening to these curves. Over the next 30 years, the population of the fragile states is set to grow very rapidly. Why? Because that's where the high fertility, high growth populations are concentrated. That's where people are having lots of children. The populations of the stable states, however, are not growing. That's where fertility has already fallen and population has stabilized. So we're heading toward a world, actually very soon. We're looking here within 25 years, where if nothing changes, we're looking at a world in which more people of working age will be living in countries of high fragility, and therefore instability, bad environments for education and investment, than are living in countries with good working conditions. And this, of course, is a terrible risk for the world economy, because if people can't work, the economy doesn't grow. So here's the global dynamic we're facing in the 21st century in a few bullet points, if I can simplify. We will have very old nations, China, Russia, Japan, Europe, even the United States and Canada will be more aged in 20 or 30 years than they are today. But we'll have all of these aging populations already with substantial economic debts. And they'll be facing very young, chronically violent, and unstable nations across Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Asia. So you're looking at problems of refugee migration flows, people streaming to try and get in to the more stable countries. You're looking at problems for how do the richer, more stable countries maintain their security and stability when they're getting older and shrinking, and the larger risk countries, the higher risk countries, are rapidly growing. Now, Russia and China are aging. And we would expect that because they're moving toward mature populations, they're more likely to transition to democracy. Russia, in fact, is probably overdue on strictly demographic grounds to have moved closer toward democracy than it has. But in a chaotic world where Russia feels there's danger all around its borders, and China feels there's instability all through Central and South Asia, they are liable to hold on to their authoritarian regimes longer than would otherwise be the case. Both China and Russia look around the world and they see, on the one hand, they've got instability all across the Middle East, which has their oil. There's instability in places like Thailand and Pakistan that they were counting on for part of their export industries and growth. They look at the democracies of the United States and Europe and they say, your economies are not growing anymore. Your populations are aging. We can't count on you to keep the sea lanes and the global trade and global governance safe and secure, like we could free ride on you doing that for the last 40 or 50 years. So China needs to build up its navy and military and keep a tight control. So it's going to stay authoritarian probably longer than it would in a world where people in China felt secure. The same thing is even more true in Russia, which feels itself surrounded by enemies now and with instability in Ukraine, as well as in other regions, worries about the threat from Middle East and Muslim regions spilling into Russia. So both of these countries are likely to remain anti-Western and authoritarian, partly because of their ideology, but even more because the demography of the world as they see it is going to be threatening to them. And here's the biggest problem of all. The global institutions that we've relied on to keep order, the United Nations, NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the G7, and the World Bank are increasingly regarded as ineffective and illegitimate. You may have heard that China is organizing its own alternative to the World Bank, an Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and that against the wishes of the United States, many of our European allies have signed up to join this new Chinese bank. Well, what should we do? Frankly, I'm sympathetic to China. The United States has blocked a bigger role for China in the International Monetary Fund and in the World Bank. If you look at the largest economies in the world, you find China, Turkey, Indonesia, Brazil are really moving up the league tables. Brazil, by some measures, has the 6th largest economy in the world. But Brazil has no seat on the Permanent Security Council at the UN. Brazil is underrepresented in the International Monetary Fund. You're not going to see officials from Latin America heading the World Bank, much less from Africa. And that simply reduces the legitimacy and the respect for those institutions. They're supposed to be global governance, but to the rest of the world, they look more and more like instruments left over from World War II, or at best the Cold War, in which the old imperialist countries are trying to hang on to power, even as their role in the global economy shrinks. So what can we do? How do we resolve this terrible conundrum? Well, 6 countries today, India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, and Pakistan, just those 6 have 48% of world population. But none of them are strongly engaged in global governance, and China is only getting more engaged because it's pushing itself forward. NATO has had difficulty meeting its defense spending targets, and this will only get more difficult as the population in Europe gets older and more tax revenue has to go into pensions and healthcare. So what can we do? We need to extend this alliance to younger and more democratic countries. It's already the case that NATO is begging for help. Whenever we go into an operation outside of NATO's borders, we want a coalition of the willing. We want allies. We want Japan. We want Korea. We want Australia. We want even India and the Gulf countries to help us out. So why not think about building a broader alliance of democratic countries to respond to instability in the world? At the very least, Australia and New Zealand could be additional NATO countries. I mean, if Albania can join, it seems crazy to keep Australia out just because it's in a different part of the world, when in fact NATO is active everywhere these days, from Afghanistan to Africa. So in the short term, not only Australia, but countries like Brazil and even India and Indonesia that have large, young populations. Europe and America are so reluctant to put boots on the ground anywhere that's necessary to keep order. We're powerless in the face of seemingly very small threats like ISIS or Boko Haram. But we are so reluctant to put boots on the ground because troops from America or Europe are extremely expensive and scarce. Meanwhile, the United Nations relies on troops from India and Pakistan and other countries for peacekeeping operations, but they're outside of NATO training or cooperation. So we need to think about making NATO a global alliance that can respond to global problems. It's no longer the case that the only mission of NATO is to defend itself in Eastern Europe. With Ukraine, it has again become a real mission, but NATO is woefully underfinanced and under-equipped. One of the things that other younger countries can offer is faster growing economies with potentially more resources to contribute. Now, I've run out of time, so I'm going to save questions on migration for question and answers. I'm sure a lot of people are worried about how do we handle migration, how do we benefit from it, and I'm happy to address that. So I certainly am willing to answer questions on that. But let me stop there simply by saying, if we can rebuild global governance to incorporate the younger, faster-growing countries into the main global economic and political and defense organizations, give them more of a shared leadership role, give them more of a stake in managing world problems, we should be able to cope with the issues ahead of us. Global population is not growing excessively fast. We're not running out of food and water. What we are running into is kind of an imbalance, a huge and growing separation between aging countries in the rich world and very young but poorly governed and not well-educated countries in the developing world. If we can close that gap and ensure that the young children growing up in developing countries have the education and the investment to become productive workers, we'll all enjoy stronger global growth. We'll have the resources that we need to meet the challenges of the future. But if we enter the next 30 years in a situation where fragile countries with weak governance institutions are the place where most of the world's global labor force is growing up and trying to work, and we don't remedy that situation, and we don't have global governance and security institutions that are regarded as legitimate and effective, then we're facing a world, unfortunately, of declining economic growth, greater difficulty in rich countries meeting their obligations and paying their debts, and a world in which we'll be looking in vain for the growth we need to give us the resources to make our lives better, not to mention improving the lives of the 1 to 2 billion people in Africa and Asia who will be demanding better lives in the future. Thank you. Let me stop there and take questions. Now, we have 2 microphones at the front, so in order to make sure I can hear your questions and that everyone else can hear your questions, please come up to the microphones. How much time do we have for questions? About 20, 30 minutes? Okay. I mean, I've been known to stay as long as people continue to throw questions at me. Take a moment or so to frame your thoughts. We've also got questions coming in on the internet. So let me start with our audience who's watching me from afar, and then I'll come back to the people who are lining up here. So Jack in Cambridge asks, what should governments and international organizations be doing now to prepare for the boom in fragile state populations? There are actually 3 different things that can be done, all of which are fairly straightforward if we recognize the problem. One is to promote secondary education and accessible family planning in countries that are currently fragile. That reduces the population growth in those countries in the future. The second is we can be a little more demanding in suggesting that countries be hard on corruption, transparent in their operations, and more respectful of human rights. I don't think it's ever done the United States any great harm to promote respect for human rights around the world. And yet we keep refraining from doing so because of anxieties about what it will cost us. So the United States has been unwilling to condemn the military regime in Egypt, for example, even though the rate of human rights violations in Egypt by the government is much higher now than it was under the former government of Hosni Mubarak. But the United States is worried about offending a potential ally in the region. George Bush said US policies for 60 years of cooperating with dictators in the Middle East really didn't turn out to make the region or the world any more stable. We didn't really benefit from that in the long run. So encouraging states that are deemed to be human rights violators and not providing services for their citizens, call them out, tell them that it's their own interest to do so. We reduce the level of fragility. And lastly, because you can't count on cooperation, and we're looking at countries that do have a very statistically high rate of failure, we need to be prepared to provide peacekeeping if we want to be able to intervene to prevent genocides and disasters. You look at what's happening in northern Nigeria, Boko Haram. Hundreds of thousands of people have been driven from their homes. This happened on a similar scale in Darfur. We're seeing Millions of people around the world, if you include Syria and Iraq, turned into refugees. We're seeing mass atrocities on our televisions, and we feel powerless to do anything about this. And the reason is we've always said, well, there won't be any more cases like Afghanistan. There won't be any more cases like Iraq. We don't have to worry about state failure in a place like Yemen because we can go ahead and bomb Al-Qaeda terrorists and not worry about the other things that are going on in that country. Well, we've learned that that's just not true. We need to recognize that fragile countries need assistance early on, and we need to build a kind of capable military reaction team. Now we're leaning on Saudi Arabia to provide the leading edge of military force in Yemen. We're relying on Iran to provide the leading edge of military force against ISIS. We have no one we can rely on to lead the containment of Boko Haram. We're hoping that Chad and Cameroon will do that. It would be a safer world if not only fewer states were fragile, but if we had something like NATO, but capable of intervening quickly to contain brush fires before they become wildfires in dangerous parts of the world. So, Jack, 3 easy things: education, education, support for human rights, particularly women's rights, and a rapid reaction force, and we'll be in much better shape. Okay, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting talk. And I'm impressed with the analytic and predictive capabilities of demographic studies. But demography isn't destiny. And I missed the slide where you talked about inequality and the concentration of wealth in increasingly smaller numbers of hands. And they aren't necessarily located just in the developed world, but in elites in the developing world.
Right. Good question about inequality. Here's what's happening in the world in this sense. Inequality among nations is actually going down. And if you were to treat the entire world as a single population, you'd see that the people who live in India and China have actually become more equal to their counterparts in Europe and North America. And there's so many of those people who have joined the global middle class, even in Africa, that overall, you have to say, global inequality is diminishing, not growing. The difference comes if you look at inequality within nations, so that within China, within India, within even Israel and Switzerland, not to mention America and Europe, the gap between the rich and the middle classes is growing, and the number of people who are being left behind in relative poverty has also increased. Now, why is that happening? It's not actually a demography effect, but it's kind of a scale effect. What we've seen is companies building global supply chains and selling to global markets. So if you run a company whose supply chain is based in Ohio, and whose customers are all in Ohio, you have to balance your business so that your customers are in fact often the same people or the neighbors of your workers. You couldn't sell products if you closed down a plant and put all your workers out of business, because not only would they be unable to buy from you, their friends and families and neighbors would boycott your company. It's a completely different dynamic when you can have a subcontractor employ 100,000 people in Vietnam or China to make products that you can then sell to markets all around the world. If you have that, you can close down your plants in Ohio or Ontario or anywhere else and still make huge profits. And so the executives at global firms have higher salaries than ever. The people who own shares in companies have higher incomes than ever. But the people who have to work for a living, and particularly those who work in low value-added manufacturing, are just being squeezed out and replaced by lower wage workers. Now, will that change? Probably it's not going to change in the near future because the global markets are here to stay. There are millions of low wage workers, not so much in China anymore, but in South Asia, in Africa, and the Middle East, who are clamoring to get jobs, even jobs that only pay $100, $200 a week. And so what workers in the rich countries are going to have to do is find things that add value at home. Personal services. I tell people the good news is for people in Europe, people in America, you're going to live in a world where you're going to be able to hire people to help you be personal shoppers, personal drivers, people who will help you design your web page, who will help you build your image, who will help choose your diet, who will help guide your physique. You see this already. I mean, there's so many services you can buy, personal trainers. You can go online and find people who will do, rabbit chore, will get things done for you. The difficulty now is a social and political decision. And that political decision is, do rich countries recognize we're in a completely different world than we were 40 or 50 years ago? We've detached production and consumption to different parts of the world. Companies are profiting from being in the middle of that. What do we do? Do we have a social obligation for people who are left behind? If we recognize that, yes, we do have a social obligation, we want people to be supportive of their country, not embittered and angry and left behind. We want their children to grow up feeling hopeful and educated, investing. It's got to involve a degree of social redistribution. We have to say, what is the social function of having an income distribution where 20% of all income goes to the top 1/2 or 1/4 of 1%? We didn't used to believe that. Under Ronald Reagan, marginal tax rates in the United States, when it was morning in America, marginal tax rates on the highest earners were 50%. Now we've lowered them to 15% for hedge fund managers. Have we got a better world? I would say I don't think we've gained by doing that. I think we've lost. We've lost funding for arts programs in the school. We've lost funding for public parks. But so far I don't win that argument. I think it's going to take a lot more kind of Occupy movements, and not by condemning capitalism or saying there's something evil. We just have to recognize global capitalism now tends to concentrate profits at the top. But even when America was at its most successful, we asked for those at the top to give back in estate taxes and in income taxes to serve public purposes. We built our highways with taxes. Now the federal tax fund is grossly depleted and our infrastructure is deteriorating. We provided universal public schooling and affordable college tuition for Americans by tax burdens that were not considered unreasonable at the time, but that seem unattainable now. So I think, again, if we say, look, the world we're living in now is different than the world we lived in 25, 30 years ago, maybe we need to take some lessons from what we did after World War II, when we were in what was then a new world, and we looked at building the future through redistribution, reasonable taxes, and public investment. So if we do that, we can meet the challenges that lie ahead. But if we just say, well, the world has changed and the concentration of wealth is what it is, and we just let it happen, then we're going to end up with a very large number of people who are shortchanged. And so I hope we avoid that.
Thank you.
I have another question from our viewers. This is Angela in Ottawa, asks, is greater inclusiveness our best bet for strengthening global governance? And how can international organizations remain agile? Now, the second one is really good. How can international organizations remain flexible and deal with this constant kind of whack-a-mole problem we have? You never know where the next breakdown or civil war or potential genocide is going to be. Well, the only way to remain agile is to have a very diverse and geographically distributed membership in the critical security alliances that we have. And we just don't have that right now. America has a bilateral arrangement with South Korea, a bilateral arrangement with Japan, bilateral arrangement with Australia, New Zealand, and a multilateral arrangement with Europe. And then we have various other agreements, just a cascade of all kinds of things. But the core security organization that we've rested on, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has grown less well-financed, less agile, less able to project force. There was a cartoon in The Economist magazine last week that I wish I had seen in time to put in my presentation. It showed NATO as this group of strong, vigorous, energetic countries that were heroes that could provide safety and security around the world. And then there's a jump 40 years to the present, and you see NATO as kind of stooped, older, poorer countries not able to lift the burden of defense. And it's unfortunately true that many countries, even the United States, has handcuffed itself with a sequester on defense spending. Now, you could say that America spends too much on defense. I agree with you. But we need to be more flexible and figure out how to spend more wisely. And we can't do that if we're simply making arbitrary across-the-board cuts, or if European countries fail to meet their NATO commitment. So the best way to re-strengthen is to diversify. That's usually the case in all walks of life, and diversification will be the key to our security in the future as well. I have a question over here.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Michael, and I'm curious about the sort of the security slide that you showed right at the end there. And I guess my greatest question there is more than security, it's the more rebalancing of international institutions. And I mean, the rebalancing in the IMF and World Bank and a lot of these institutions was blocked by, basically by Congress in the United States. And I think you're very right in that, I mean, to have sympathy with, say, China, for instance, in terms of wanting to build an alternative because they couldn't get existing institutions rebalanced. Right. And I'm curious, do you see any prospect for Congress getting out of the way or acquiescing to a more sort of equal setup in international governance? And on the flip side, you talk about bringing in vigorous young democracies like Brazil and India to help share the burden and building a greater sort of diversity to have a greater agility. But countries like Brazil and India, which have pretty spotty histories with much of the rest of the West, especially with the United States, why would they want to join one of these alliances? And even if they did, I mean, there's a reason why the United States prefers coalitions of the willing. They think they can get things done more easily when there are fewer voices in the room. How do you think we would be able to manage to actually aggregate interests and actually come to an agreement to get things done?
Look, is it idealistic to a degree to think about that? Yes, for two reasons. One, right now, US Congress blocks everything, right? It may block a treaty to reduce Iran's progress toward nuclearization. It certainly, a majority of Congress would like to repeal America's health care reforms. There's a kind of constant chorus of no, is the story of the American government at the moment. That also is going to change because of demography. America is becoming a country that is more diverse. We've seen astounding progress on tolerance for gay marriage as an institution that can strengthen the family rather than weaken it. Most of the electorate just doesn't care about that as an issue anymore. Now, the electorate still cares a great deal about immigration, but 20 years from now, when 40% of all Americans are Hispanic, I doubt that today's immigration debates will look anything, you know, I doubt they would continue into the future, I mean, as they are now. So America is changing. Congress will do, at the end of the day, what the American people want it to do. What's driving American politics now is you have an older generation of Anglo-Europeans who feel threatened. They feel threatened by globalization. They feel threatened by the growth of Muslim populations around the world. They feel threatened by the growth of all kinds of minorities, Asian, Hispanic, and other in the United States. And so they would like to roll the clock backward to a time not that long ago, but even as recently as 1970, 1980, when the vast majority of Americans were comfortable as kind of one dominant ethnic group, and America felt more or less the leader of the free world without having to rely too much on anyone else. And as long as that group insists on trying to roll reality back to a time that's lost, our political system will suffer from dysfunction because we can't do it. There are certain valuable lessons we could learn about being willing to take on debt, investing in roads and highways. Those things from the 50s and 60s I think are worth learning from and repeating. But that's not the reality people want to go back to. They want to go back to a feeling of security while still having absurdly low taxes and low government. So yes, we're right now in a difficult position in the United States. I think, however, that within the next decade, we'll start to see a reduction of the power of the Tea Party, and we'll hopefully see a willingness to move toward greater pragmatism. Now, will that have an effect on countries like Brazil and India? Would they be more willing to join in America and Europe in improving the world? I would say if they are given a role that they deserve in global economic governance, commensurate with their economic weight in the world, they'll be more likely to join a global security alliance that, after all, has as its main purpose maintaining the conditions for economic growth in all of its member countries. Cooperation with NATO would help strengthen and improve the quality of the equipment and the training that their militaries would get. And the prestige of being able to call themselves part of the world's leading alliance does have attraction to the professional militaries of those countries. There was a time, of course, when militaries around the world looked to the United States for training and equipment, and unfortunately, even that has diminished. So much so, for example, that in Pakistan, a military that used to view America as a friend, a lot of the Pakistani military now have never trained or drilled with Americans, and they view America as an unknown and possibly dangerous foe. So I think it will take work and patience, as anything worthwhile does, right? But I think it's possible, difficult for sure, but possible to diversify the global security and governance alliances. I tell you, one big success has been the World Trade Organization. That's one good example of truly broad and inclusive multilateral global organization that has worked. Same with the Montreal Protocol on controlling emissions that destroyed ozone in the atmosphere. So there are examples of successful global cooperation when people feel there's a pressing need. I just hope that we don't regard all of these state breakdowns around the world as, yes, it's tragic, but it's a one-off thing, it's not going to happen again. We always say that. We said that after the Balkans. We said that after the Congo. We said that after Afghanistan, after Iraq. Now are we going to say it again after Yemen and Nigeria? We live in a world where chronic state breakdown is part of the security framework, and it does feed terrorism and it feeds global insecurity. And unless we redesign global governance institutions to cope with that, we're going to find ourselves continually, just like we are today, in facing a breakdown in Yemen saying, well, gee, I didn't expect that. I don't know who is going to respond to that, and I don't know what the consequences will be. So let's try and get out of that situation, and I think we can do so. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Margaret Walton-Roberts. I'm one of the faculty affiliated with the Balsillie School of International Affairs. I was kind of interested, you didn't mention sex ratio imbalance at all in your presentation, and I wonder what your thoughts are with regards to that, because there are some concerns that sex ratio imbalance will aggravate this issue of insecurity and conflict, and it also undermines gender rights generally. And so your observations on that I'd be interested in.
Sure. Valerie Hudson, a wonderful scholar at Texas A&M University, has done some of the best research on gender imbalances, but she's also leading a research project looking more broadly at the impact of protection of women's rights on civil conflict in general. And the findings are fairly strong that where women have a stronger role in society, conflicts are less likely. Now, you mentioned the gender imbalance that has arisen, particularly in places like China and India, from parents' sex selection of their children. Those imbalances have grown severe. I don't worry greatly about violence of young men who feel they cannot find wives. And the reason I say that is because India and China are importing brides from the Philippines and Myanmar and South Asia. I worry more about the impact of the demand for brides on sex trafficking and women's enslavement. I also worry more about the imbalance in education and nutrition for young women all across the developing world than the gender imbalance that arises because some women were not born because they were aborted as fetuses. That is a tragedy, but a kind of instant one, whereas young women who grow up literally being sacrificed in their education and nutrition to preserve a patriarchy so their older brothers can be educated and become dominant, that's the greater tragedy and I think the greater risk. So I think gender imbalance, if by that you mean the general favoritism for young men in regard to everything, education, nutrition, jobs, opportunities, that comes from discrimination or devaluing of women, it is not only a human rights and women's rights disaster, it's a security and development disaster. And we need to do everything we can. As I said, the biggest single investment I would encourage people to make is in secondary education for women, where secondary education rates are too low. If we can just remedy that imbalance, many other things will change. And frankly, we also find, as we did in South Korea, which also had this terrible imbalance program, as women become more educated and more empowered, they become less subject to the pressures for sex selection in their children. They are the mothers, and if they have confidence in themselves, they're more likely to value their female children equally with their sons. And it's that type of equality that paves the way for sons and daughters to be treated equally. So let's definitely address gender imbalance, but not just at the level of selective abortion or infanticide. Let's pay attention to gender imbalance at every stage in the raising of children, their education, their jobs, their career opportunities, and their voice in society. That's what we need.
And
yes,
just
follow-up?
One follow-up.
Yep.
In light of that, would it be worth considering gender imbalance as your 6th new population bomb?
I'd have to point to a population group that is growing faster than the world population. And fortunately, because of progress in education and the decline of fertility, gender imbalances, like poverty, are still, numerous in some parts of the world. But fortunately for women in Latin America, for women in China, things have gotten much better than they were 30 or 40 years ago. So I think it's a major issue, but I don't call it part of the population bomb because it's not a disproportionate growth phenomenon. It's kind of a leftover hassle and disaster that we inherited with the remnants of these very patriarchal societies that unfortunately tended to dominate the social world for centuries and that we've only briefly grown out of. I mean, you raise this. I tell people, look, women in Switzerland didn't have the right to vote until I think that the 1970s or so. Europeans are just as guilty. In Eastern Europe, I've had students who work on problems of spousal abuse. And just like it took Europeans a long time to say, having teachers beat their students with rods is wrong. We shouldn't do that. It was actually taken as, good educational practice, right, for centuries. So we have had to grow and mature in giving rights to children and in giving rights to women. And just as Europe, I think, has improved in this regard, it is now a crime to batter your spouse in many parts of the world where it was considered perfectly acceptable practice for a prior generation. So we're making progress. Women's rights, no thanks to me, mainly thanks to the effort of women who are fighting for themselves, but women's rights are making progress around the world. There's a lot still to be done, but thank God I can say women in many, many countries are in a much better position than we would have imagined 100 years ago. And I hope we'll have a woman president in the United States before long, and that she can lead a global campaign in favor of women's rights. And maybe that will be what it takes to help move things forward. Sir.
I'm Joseph Wall from Kitchener here. I wanted to follow up with respect to the current situation that we're in. We had a lecture last week on environmental situations of humankind. Now today we have the population aspect. And the United Nations, which is supposed to play the role of preparing the ground for the global community with respect to this challenge that we have. My question is around what, according to you, do you think the UN can do differently to change this current situation of coalition of the willing and the coalition of unwilling, which is happening in the countries that we see have the populations explosions in years to come as the developed countries are going down the drain with respect to the population?
Well, this will have to be the last question, and it's a very good but depressing one. But let me give you a positive answer. The United Nations does more good than most people know. The United Nations Children's Educational Fund, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, which played absolutely vital role in stopping the spread of Ebola in West Africa. So many social service roles, peacekeeping roles are taken by the United Nations with great effect. Unfortunately, because of the deadlocks in the Security Council of the United Nations, many people dismiss that organization as ineffective. They say, it's just a cabal of 5 countries, they can't agree on anything, and so respect for the UN declines. And you know what happens when respect for the UN declines? Funding for the UN declines, because countries are less willing to support it. I think there is a role for the United Nations to play, but it will have to get a better reputation for the good that it does, and it will somehow have to broker a stronger role for the emerging countries of the world. Right now, you have this difficult situation where the permanent members of the Security Council almost act like they think they're adults and everyone else has limited responsibilities. And it's certainly true at the end of World War II that the victors felt that they had earned the right to hold a veto on whatever else the world did, because the world had just thrown itself into international chaos in World War II. The victors were putting the world back together. They wanted to make sure that the United Nations didn't do anything to upset their plans for rebuilding the world. We didn't know that we'd go immediately into the Cold War and that the United Nations would be caught in the middle. So right now, the members of the Permanent Security Council are at loggerheads. Very unlikely that China and Russia will agree with most things that America wants, and then France and England are kind of sort of with the US, but abstain on other things. So one element of the United Nations is stuck, and probably will be stuck for a while. So I think it's very important for the United Nations to remind people of all the good things it does in the world and say, okay, the Security Council permanent membership is not getting anywhere right now, but that's not the whole picture. There are many other areas in which the United Nations is doing enormous good. Their refugee organization, helping refugees, maintaining refugee camps for people fleeing violent conflicts. Without them, we'd have tens of millions of people who would be in utter desperation. The United Nations is taking care of them. So If all of that good work gets more attention and more support, perhaps the UN will be strengthened, and maybe someday it can become effective and enlarge the Security Council permanent membership to become more legitimate. But unfortunately, in the short term, I think we have better odds even of extending NATO to be more effective than of changing the balance in the Permanent Security Council. I think I have to stop there. Is that right? Now, thank you very much for the question, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I think now...
Do something with respect to that, because he's the one now controlling the United Nations. This is the general perception.
Well, there's a general conception that the United States controls everything in the world, and it's just not true. Unfortunately, if you're in Russia, you'll hear that the United States is behind the collapse of the Ukraine. If you're in China, you'll hear that the United States is behind the conflict over disputed islands in the South China Sea. If you're in Egypt, you'll hear that America was behind the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's no end to what you'll hear about the terrible things that the United States is capable of. Unfortunately, the reality is the United States is capable of less and less, which is why we need to strengthen our alliances.
A few quick comments before we adjourn. First of all, I want to thank Professor Jack Goldstone for his excellent address this evening. Initially, when he began to talk, I was worrying about living in a world in 2050 where 1 in 10 is 80, but then I remembered that I'll be 93. And you know, with all those 80-year-olds around, we 93-year-olds will have something to look forward to after work on Friday. And we'll be living in Costa Rica. I'm sorry to make light of your presentation, in fact, and I was listening. You made very insightful and important comments about the challenges that lie ahead due to demography and the way we can respond through good policies, whether it's education for women, new energy regimes that can help avert climate change, and reforms in international governance institutions to achieve greater security and stability through inclusion. Those are great messages. Those are the things that CG cares about. And so for coming all the way to Waterloo from Washington and sharing your insights, we thank you once again. You'll find the edited video of tonight's live webcast on the CG website in a day or two, and we'll post a blog about this event where you can add your own comments. And then in the coming weeks, we invite you to join us at a few more public events in the CG Auditorium. On Thursday, April 16th, please come for a lecture with Derek Gregory called Dirty Dancing, Drones and Death in the Borderlands. On April 28th, our cinema series resumes with a screening of Red Lines, a documentary following 2 young Syrian activists who launch a radical plan for bringing democracy to their country. And then the following day, April 29th, we welcome digital media expert Taylor Owen to the CG Auditorium to discuss Disruptive Power, the Crisis of the State in the Digital Age. Register online for the CG Events newsletter to find out about these events and others. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a safe journey home.
Running at 2 to 3% a year worldwide. And in response to that, we got busy. We got busy making family planning more widely available and affordable, and making a green revolution to make feeding a growing population easier and cheaper. And the combination of a revolution in agriculture and the spread of family planning meant we averted the severe problems. That's good news. I mean, a lot of people have said, well, it just shows that there was no real population threat. I don't think that's the case. I think we learned about the threat we faced and we dealt with it. And now, today, we're facing new threats from different kind of population growth. It's the growth of certain subgroups. The aging population, people like me, a lot of us out there, we are all surprisingly healthy, increasingly long-lived, and numerous. The African population, it's a good thing. The African population, as I mentioned, is growing very fast. The African economy is growing very fast. Something that people have only recently woken up to is the very rapid growth of a global middle class. People with incomes in the range of $5,000 US per year, able to afford modern appliances, inexpensive automobiles, travel, local, increasingly international travel, that global middle class is growing much faster than the population as a whole, as poorer countries move up the income ladder. The urban population is also very fast growing. More and more people are moving to cities, even in South Asia, Africa, and China. They are moving toward West European and American levels of urbanization. That is, they're moving to a situation where 3/4 or more of the population live clustered in cities. Now, this is new for mankind as a whole. Humanity has always been predominantly rural, all the way from 50,000 years ago up to about 15 years ago. And it was only in the first decade of this century that the percentage of human beings living in metropolitan areas and large cities has gone over 50% of the total population. And it's going to continue to grow. So we're moving into a world where the urban human being will be typical, and that's never been the case before. And finally, and here's where we really get to the issues of global governance and international security, the population of what we call fragile states, places like Yemen, Somalia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pakistan, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan, these countries are growing at a quite surprising rate. You might think, gee, those places, they're beset by conflict, they're running short on resources, why would population be growing there? Well, it turns out a slowdown in population growth is a feature of prosperity. When people feel they have the security and the autonomy to get by with a smaller family, and they have the means to exercise in the future, and meat may be more expensive, but the population of the world is not going to starve. So what's it going to be like to live in this world of slower growth? Well, it's not all good. For most of the end of the last century, growth averaged 4% a year in population. And although you could say, well, isn't that a tremendous drain and a strain on resources, it was also a very powerful motor for economic growth. And the innovations to meet those demands in housing, in clothing, in food, in entertainment, in travel, improved the quality of life for everyone. Now, that growth is going away. Growth is very unlikely to exceed 3%, and indeed often 2.5%. And in some countries, growth is already turning negative. Japan and Germany already are seeing population decline. Now, Africa is a case where you can say, but isn't population growth still going to be overwhelming in Africa? And the answer is yes, and we have to worry about that. But again, to take a look at the global picture, even very rapid growth of the economies in Africa, I mean, assume that they continue to have 2 to 3% population growth a year, assume that their economies start catching up with the West. Let's say they get GDP growth of 7% a year. That's great for Africa. However, globally, we're seeing a slowdown in China, a slowdown in Brazil, a slowdown in Russia. The economy of Europe is stuck in the doldrums. The economy of America is being hailed as the motor of the world when it's only growing at 2.5% a year. So we're looking at a world of generally much slower economic growth. Probably at best, global economic growth rates will be half in the next half century what they were in the preceding half century. And we'll just have to adjust to that somehow. There's no way that we can somehow light a fire. We can talk about great technological changes. Will there be self-driving cars? Probably. Will we be able to print various widgets and circuit boards? Yes. But all of those things do not replace the demand for goods and services that comes from a young, growing population. So we're going to have a world of slower growth overall, population growth around the world leveling off. However, that doesn't mean that everything is going to grow at that same slow pace. There are at least 5 population groups that are going to grow very fast, quite a bit faster than the world population. Now, I've referred to this kind of subgroup explosion as the new population bomb. The old population bomb was something Paul Ehrlich wrote about in the 1960s. He worried that world population was going to flood poor countries, that they would suffer from starvation, mass disease. None of that has happened. But I think part of the reason we avoided that is that Ehrlich raised his standard and called attention to the fact that population growth was
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we say. My name's Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG, and I'd like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CG Signature Lecture Series. Thanks also to all of you for joining us at this event, whether you're here as part of our live audience or joining us through our webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences at the microphones here at CG at the stairs, or through the live chat function on your screen if you're watching from home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Anytime a population grows, change erupts, whether in the context of a growing family, a thriving business, or, as we'll see in tonight's lecture, a growing world. Population growth requires new rules, norms, leadership, and governance. Here to discuss the new governance required for a world of 10 billion people is Professor Jack Goldstone. Jack comes to us tonight from Washington, D.C., where he's John T. Hazel Professor of Public Policy and Senior Fellow at the Mercatus Center of George Mason University. He's also the Director of the Center for Global Policy at that university and serves as a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. Jack's research is focused on economic growth in the global economy and effects of population growth. He recently published the edited volume, Political Demography: How Population Changes Are Reshaping International Security and National Politics. He's now working on 2 volumes addressing politics. And I can also highly recommend his 2013 book, Revolutions, a very short introduction. So please join me now in welcoming tonight's distinguished guest, Professor Jack Goldstone.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Waterloo and at CG. Tonight I'm going to talk about what we need to have a well-run world of 10 billion people. 10 billion people is what we expect to have actually very soon, by the middle of this century, if not sooner. Now, a lot of people will tell you that's just too many people. But I don't think that's the real issue. We have a little over 7 billion people in the world now. I think we can manage an additional 3 billion without too much trouble. The real problem comes in understanding where those people are, how old they will be, and how we redistribute resources around the world. Now let me give you the good news first. And the good news is that global population growth is actually slowing down quite a bit. Now, this growth curve is what scares a lot of people. You see population growing. 1950, less than 3 billion, jumps to 6 billion by the turn of the millennium, and we're now about 7 billion, well on our way to 10 billion. But shortly after that, growth should cease. It may trickle on a little bit. We may get to 10.5 billion. Some people are worried about 11 or more. But this very rapid growth that we've gone through is coming to an end. And you can see that more clearly on this lower curve. This is the growth rate, which was about 2% a year all the way from 1950 to 1990. But then something happened. Growth rates dropped. Now global growth rate is down to about 1% a year. It'll be down to about 0.5% a year by 2040 and will gradually disappear. Now, the reason for that's straightforward. People all over the world, in rich countries, poor countries, big countries, small countries, the more women get educated, the more income people have, the more they choose to invest more of their resources in fewer but better educated and better nourished children. So for, surprisingly, almost all the countries in the world, whether you're talking about India, China, Indonesia, as well as Europe and America, Russia, in all of these countries, the number of children that women are having has dropped pretty close to or even below 2 children per family. Even countries like Brazil are down below 2 children per family, so below replacement. So although some countries in the world are growing fast, which I will mention as we go on, the majority of countries in the world are seeing a steady decline in population growth, and so the rate of expansion that our children will have to live with is going to be much less than the kind of very dramatic growth that has occurred in the last 50 years. Moreover, world food production has done very well. Bigger problem in much of the developing world today is obesity rather than malnutrition. It is true that there's still far too many people living in poverty and suffering food insecurity. Probably around 1 billion people today still are hungry and malnourished, some of them right here in North America, particularly in the United States and Mexico. But that's the exception now. The great majority of people have enough food to eat. The big demands on our food system in the future will be the demand for richer diets, more meat, more steaks, more poultry, more bacon. Producing meat is a labor and especially water and energy intensive process, and that is where we may run into some issues in the future. But right now, there's still a lot of arable land in the world that is not irrigated, that could be more productive than it is today, and we're seeing improvements in fertility of the soil where it's well cared for. We're seeing advances in hydroponics. So I can tell you, population growth is slowing down, food production is up. As long as we don't suffer a catastrophic change in climate, which is a very real risk, as I'll allude to later, but as long as our climate holds up reasonably well, we should be able to feed ourselves well into the future. We may not get the same selection of seafood as family planning. That's when fertility goes down. When people feel that the social fabric is being rent asunder and they're under threat and family is the best security they have, birth rates stay high. So each of these groups poses its own dimension for the world of 10 billion population that we'll live in. Now here's a graph. It looks very different from the first one I showed you. This is the population, and this unfortunately got mixed up in the printing. Forgive me. The blue is the global population in the more developed nations. That's a smaller group. It's still growing fairly rapidly. Here we are in 2010. It's going to roughly double in the next 30 years. But this huge takeoff in elderly population is occurring in the developing world. It's countries like China, India, Brazil, that are going to have tens and even hundreds of millions of people over age 60 before this century is out. I mean, that makes sense. India and China have over 2 billion people now. Their lifespans are growing, just like ours have been, and their birth rates are dropping. So they're following the path of Western countries and will be aging as well. So I tell people there's a booming economic market out there in goods and services for people over age 60. It's not just people in Europe and the US, it's a global market. And so whoever becomes the world leader in providing the goods and services that are attractive to people over age 60, which now includes me, that's going to be a big economic benefit in the future. I actually done some work looking at things. For example, you take Nigeria. Nigeria is everybody's favorite rapidly developing country. Despite Boko Haram and the mess in the northeast, Lagos is booming, Nigeria's economy is booming, and people say that that's a great emerging market. And that's true, but it turns out that even if the Nigerian market were to double every 25 years, it's still a relatively small base. A much bigger market is the purchasing power of Europeans 60 and over. In fact, that group is probably going to gain more in purchasing power than the entire population of Nigeria over the next 30 years. Now, the group that is going to be more of an issue for public services and health management is not the population over 60. Fortunately, 60 is like the new 40. That is, the generation reaching 60 now is healthier, more active, more likely to be employed. But the population that is really increasing is the group we sometimes call the very old, and that is those over 80. Now, 30 odd years ago, 1 out of every 50 people in the rich world was over 80. Now, 1 out of 50, that's not very many. That would mean, in a room like this, 2 or 3 people. But as of 2000, it had gone to 1 in 33. That starts to build up.